that was a wonderful piece of advice, actually, a friend gave me. He was like, just try this for 6 months. You can always go back to drinking. And that really made it very possible for me. And I like that perspective. And I share that frequently because it takes this scary nature of, oh my God, I have to change this forever. But you can do 6 months. Most of us can look at that time period and say, okay, this is doable. Why don't I try this? Why don't I do some research with being sober and see what that feels like?
On this week's show, I've got Dr. Alice Kirby from San Diego in California, who's the host of the Beyond the Pink Cloud podcast. So Dr. Kirby, or Dr. Alice, sorry, I'm not sure which you prefer there. Dr. Alice. I'll get used to it. Dr. Alice, welcome to the show. How about you tell the listeners about yourself and your podcast?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. And so I'm Dr. Alice Kirby. I'm a doctor of physical therapy, as well as a health consultant and a somatic experiencing practitioner in training. And a lot of people haven't heard of somatic experiencing. It's essentially, I'm a trauma practitioner. So I work with trauma. I work with chronic stress and anxiety primarily within my consulting work. And I'm based here in San Diego. And I started my podcast Beyond the Pink Cloud about a year ago. I have a special love for working with women in recovery from alcohol addiction and sober women who have moved forward from that place in their lives where they've been very, dependent or struggled with using a substance, or even women who are more like gray area drinkers or just want to try something other than alcohol to help with anxiety or stress or calming them down. And so I started the podcast as really for that community of ways to move forward beyond recovery. And I'm so happy with the direction it's taken, because of course we certainly still hold that in the theme of the podcast, but it's really evolved into just a place full of information. I have guests on every week. And so I interview people I had Dr. Neil Barnard on, who is really big. He's a psychologist based in Washington, D.C., that does a lot within the plant-based movement. And he's published, I think, 17 books and a bazillion, research articles, but he's had phenomenal results with people actually reversing diabetes using a plant-based diet, and with women who have been able to really heal endometriosis and really, painful menstrual cramps and debilitating, menstrual type syndrome. So he was really interesting to talk to. And then I just recently had on Bruce Perry, who produced the BBC show Tribe and is this documentarian, and he's lived all over the world with Indigenous people. And so we talked a bit about the egalitarian tribes and what that's like to live with people that really don't have anyone who's in charge, and nobody is able to be in charge. So it really is this sense of equality within a community. So it was really lovely to talk with him. So anyway, I get really excited about the show because there's just, I love how many of these amazing people come on and speak with me and really give my audience a sense of, oh, there's all these other things in life. Like if they are sober, now that I'm sober, like look at all these other ways I can delve into my own journey of just really thriving and being my essential self.
Right. And for people that may not be aware of the term pink cloud, what does that define?
Sure. So it's a recovery term, and I don't know if it's just like in 12-step recovery or if it's more broad, but I know it as there's this time period, almost like a honeymoon phase, I think we could relate it to, in a relationship where everything's really lovey and feels really great. And, it's like this with recovery. So when you give up a substance, or when you get sober from alcohol or drugs or whatever your thing is, there can be this time period. And not everyone goes through this, but a lot of people experience it. And it's called the pink cloud. That's essentially where you're just kind of floating on this happy cloud and you realize how great life is. And I think it's before maybe some more the work can come in around, recovery. But some people stay on it for a really long time and just feel really good now that they're free of addiction and substance. So that's where the term the pink cloud comes from. And so beyond the pink cloud is really like, okay, now that we're moving forward in our lives, what's next and how can we continue to thrive?
Right. And I know you'd mentioned that obviously your professional job is a therapist, and the podcast is more about recovery from addiction. But obviously some of that can be down to trauma and, recovering from therapy. Where did the idea of the podcast come about from? Was it people you were speaking with, friends, etc.? Or how did it come from, say, your professional day job into the kind of addiction focused, topic of the podcast?
Sure.
Or addiction recovery, sorry.
Yeah, sure. And so I've been transitioning from practicing more as a DPT, as a doctor of physical therapy, over the past year and a half, really. So I don't actually see that many patients anymore. I do a little bit of PT still, but not a lot, because I've really moved more into the trauma recovery work because it's so valuable. And I'll certainly use that with some of my PT clients because it's great for any kind of like motor vehicle accidents or falls or even surgical prep, things like that. The trauma work is hugely important and works really, really well for those things. But in my own life, I got sober almost 3 years ago, and I had really struggled a lot with addiction, with alcohol specifically was my thing. And even as I was finishing some of my clinical internships and rotations through my doctorate program, I was really struggling with a lot of anxiety and stress in my personal life, and like really having to claw myself to like. I have this picture of like digging out of a hole, like really just clinging to a wall. That's really what it felt like in this last bit of my education. So my own drinking really took me down, and I'm quite lucky because I was able to get help and go into some recovery and experience that pink cloud for myself. And then at the same time, I was working with a therapist who introduced me to the somatic experiencing tools, and I really resonated with that work, and it helped me so much in my early sobriety. It continues to help me a bunch now, but it was really, I think, quite pivotal for me to make that switch of knowing, okay, not just do I want to give up this substance, but I'm gaining this sense of myself and this sense of being able to really feel good in my body. And so that was very powerful for me to want to stay sober. So the podcast just came about as part of this greater step into working more with sober women or working more with women who are under a lot of chronic stress or anxiety. I work frequently with women in the corporate sector as well, even if they don't have the issue with alcohol. It's almost this addiction to high achieving or addiction to like work and stress where we get so used to it that it becomes part of our identity is what I've seen with a lot of the women I work with. They're like, well, if I change my job, I don't know who I am. So it's kind of a long answer, but
no, it's interesting to hear, from your own personal experience, how that grew into what you talk about now and the people you're helping now through the show. And I know, like, some of the people I've spoken to while we've been sort of in the green room prior to show recordings, for example, we've spoken about the impact that COVID-19's had on people's mental health and the stress levels. And some of that is down to the fact that now a lot more people are working from home for the first time. They're finding it hard to switch off because they don't have that dedicated 9 a.m. start, 5 p.m. cutoff point, and then you're driving home, commuting or whatever. Is that something that you've possibly found, at the last few months, or people you've spoken to on your own show, that stress levels are increasing as workload, etc., increases over the last few months because of the pandemic and the fact that we've got more time to allocate to work that we wouldn't normally do?
I think so. I mean, definitely, I think, yes, overall stress has been pretty high on a global scale. And I think part of that is that we when you think about it from a trauma perspective and trying to like orient to the threat of like what's coming for us, and there's no real visual thing to orient to or to find. Or so it's like we're trying to place ourselves in relation to this scary thing or this threatening thing. But I love your point about working from home because that's huge for people. And particularly, I tend to work with women, not exclusively, but primarily, and working with women who have children in her home and are trying to do their busy jobs and yet also caretake all the time. I know that's been incredibly stressful for people as well. And some of the things that I encourage people to do, to speak to your point of they're home all the time. So work can just go on into the night. It can start earlier. There isn't the same constraints or bookmarks of like I start work and I end work. So having people, if they can, to set aside a space in their home, even if it's just a table somewhere and that's just designated for work. So to have a particular space that's just around work and you don't sit there and do other things if you can. And I know not everyone can do that, but if you can even have like a small corner that's just for work. And I've been doing that myself because I'll notice the same thing where it's 10 o'clock and I'm doing this or that for my business. And I'm like, you have to stop.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I know you mentioned earlier about the guests that you've been having on and the conversations you've been having on the shows. And I noticed that there's, looking at your episodes, you're up to, is about episode 32, 33 at the moment?
I think 33 was the last one.
Yeah. And it looks like you've got a solid mix of health professionals and then what I would say is normal, everyday people, even though they're well known in their fields. Was it always a goal to have a mixture of health conversations as well as, creatives and professional people, or did that come about organically?
I think it did come about organically. I really, my goal with going into it was to provide the listeners a wide range of perspectives on how to move forward in life. And in the beginning, it was more recovery focused. I had more kind of recovery coaches or people like that on, people talking about their own recovery journeys. But as it's expanded, like I was saying earlier, I've really enjoyed the opportunity, and I know my audience does too, to have these people from all these various fields and levels of experience and expertise that aren't necessarily tied into the recovery community, but that do offer a different perspective on what life could be like. And for me personally, I really like talking to people who are living their inspiration, and who are working in a field of their inspiration, because I think that just gives the rest of us the ability to see, oh, this is possible for me. And, oh, I can follow some of these things that call to me.
And speaking of the guests, as we mentioned, there's been a wide variety with very open, raw topics at time. Has there been, and not to try to put you on the spot or anything, but has there been possibly like an episode that's really stood out or impacted you out of the shows that you've completed so far?
Oh, it's such a great question. I don't think anyone's asked me that before. I have my favorites. I do have some where I just really, and not because anyone's better than anyone else, but I've had guests that I've just really enjoyed and gotten a lot out. Kirsten Johnson was one of them. She lives over in Bali and has this book called The Heartgasm Revolution, and she's big in the sober community. But I just loved her story, and her vibe was so infectious. And I feel like she's one of those people that's really embodying what she's preaching, what she's working with. And she was just a delight to speak with. I had Jason Stevenson on, who's someone I've really admired for a long time. I love his work. He's a meditation coach and is pretty big on YouTube. And my mom loves him, it was exciting for her. She's like, you're going to interview him. And so that was neat. And he was just a lovely guy. Sometimes, and the same thing with Bruce Perry, where I'm a big fan of his work. And so it was neat to just sit down with the person. I don't know if those have been hugely impactful on my own personal life, but I do get something out of everyone I speak to. And I think it really does draw back to what I was saying earlier, that seeing people that are really living their dreams and are really inspired and motivated in their work is definitely just a catalyst for me to continue with my own journey and hopefully for the audience as well.
Yeah. No, I know, I'm really jealous that she lives in Bali. I did a flyover there once when I was in Australia many years ago, and I was only there for an evening, but it was just an incredible island. So I'm super jealous that she actually lives there.
I know. It's me too. It's coming up on the list.
Yeah. Now, you'd mentioned that the podcast sprung from your own personal experience and your own sobriety journey from the last 3 years. What do you feel is the biggest hurdle to overcome an addiction, whether it's, substance abuse, alcohol abuse, etc.? Is there something that you find is a sort of, a similar obstacle for most people, and how do you help with that overcoming?
Yeah, I think that's a great question as well. And, I don't know if there's any one biggest thing. I think I can speak from my own experience. Like, I really had to get over the idea of like being able to moderate or being able to control my drinking. I had to just accept that I can't, alcohol is not for me. It's just not. I can't drink. If I do, it just goes bad. And I've proven that because I've done a lot of research in that area and my personal life. And it's not something I can do. And some people can. Some people can moderate and be very well. But I think you have to really take an honest look at yourself. And if it's something, whatever the thing is, if it's something that if it's negatively impacting your life, and that could be maybe you have a glass of wine a night, but if that's keeping you from reaching your creative potential and you feel like you can really do more and offer more and be more in your life, and that's keeping you from that, then you've got to be really honest with yourself of what role is this substance playing for you, or what role is this behavior playing for you? And I think if you can get honest with yourself on that, then seek out community, seek out some kind of support and help around it, whether that's a counselor, whether it's working with the coach, whether it's some kind of a group recovery program. There's tons of different options for people now around things. Alcohol in particular, I'm quite aware of because that's the field that I work in. But there's a million different options, because a lot of people say, well, I don't want to go to a 12-step thing, and that's fine. There's 10 other things you can go try, but you've got to try something. And building that community, I think, is essential, whoever that's with. But just to be around other people who can relate to what you're going through, relate to what you've gone through, I think that helps. It's huge. It's huge for recovery.
I know I've got a friend who, battled his own alcohol addictions. And one of the things he constantly said was the point you made about having that community network around you of people that have either experienced it previously or are currently experiencing it because they can relate and they know what you're going through, whereas, say, a partner or a colleague or a friend or anything may not, be able to understand what you're going through and give you bad advice, even though they think they're giving you friendly, good advice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've had some women who have wanted to kind of question their relationship with alcohol, but one of the women that I'm working with currently, she mentioned, oh, this person who's close to me in my life told me, oh, but you never really had that much of a problem. You never hurt anyone. You never were driving drunk or anything like that. But she knew that it was really detrimental for her. So I think if inside, like, it's not always good to listen to those people that are saying, well, maybe it's not that big of a deal because they don't live within you. So trust yourself a bit around that. If you think it's a problem, then try not doing it. That was a wonderful piece of advice, actually, a friend gave me. He was like, just try this for 6 months. You can always go back to drinking. And that really made it very possible for me. And I like that perspective. And I share that frequently because it takes this scary nature of, oh my God, I have to change this forever. But you can do 6 months. Most of us can look at that time period and say, okay, this is doable. Why don't I try this? Why don't I do some research with being sober and see what that feels like?
All right. And I think a lot of that comes down to, like, certainly I look at the UK, it's got a very big drinking mindset culture. And I compare that to, say, North America, with Canada, the US. And it's very different. In the UK, it's celebrated. Nobody trusts you unless you have a beer in hand or something.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting to, I came to Canada 14 years ago almost. And it's been interesting to continue to watch my friends back in the UK and their behaviours and how that is so different over here.
Is it different in Canada? What's it like there with the drinking?
Yeah, it's weird in Canada because Canada's that sort of weird halfway house between the UK and the US, I think. It's like we're closer to the UK than the US in mindset, but we're closer to the US in a lot of things. So I think there's definitely a party culture here, but I think Canadians do a better job at managing it. They don't have bars open till, say, 4 a.m. or 24-hour nightclubbing, etc., that you have in the UK. And I think that definitely... there's not like a pub scene. Like in the UK, there's very much a pub scene. Every little town's got at least 2 or 3 pubs on the same street. It's crazy. Whereas here, not so much. I think that helps for sure.
Definitely does. Yeah, I would think so.
So with the podcast, was there, because obviously you mentioned that you'd started a podcast to learn from your own journey and share your lessons and help women, looking to become sober or continue on a journey of sobriety. Were there any sort of obstacles that you had to overcome as a podcaster coming into the space, talking about, something that some people might not want to hear about or talk about?
Yeah, definitely. It's a little scary, particularly the first couple episodes where I sort of shared my story. And I think also getting over the hurdle of being able to interview people and speak articulately. There's certainly an art that comes with that, and time helps a lot. And I've noticed more frequently, I've been guesting on more podcasts and really sharing a lot of more of the details of my own story. And I went back and listened to one, and I definitely had a moment of, because I know my mom had listened to it, and I had this moment of like, wow, that was really pretty raw and vulnerable. I just shared all that in this very public space. So some of that will come up. And I think as long as, for me, as long as I'm feeling quite grounded and true to myself, then it's okay. Because I think being vulnerable and sharing these experiences are what really can help other people to know, okay, I'm not alone. Other people have gone through this and they've come out the other side, and they're not still stuck in this really miserable place of addiction.
Right. And I know you mentioned the first few episodes were about yourself and, and you had lessons as a podcaster as well. So if you were to give advice, like any piece of advice for either someone that's looking to get into podcasting or a health professional like yourself, or someone that's got a similar story to yourself and is looking for an outlet, what would be your piece of advice for someone looking to begin?
Well, I recently learned about Libsyn as far as a podcast host, and I did my podcast on Anchor, and I'm still currently hosting it there, but I've recently learned a bit more about why that's not the best platform and other platforms. So I think doing a little bit of research actually on the mechanics of what is a good platform, talk to other podcasters. Anytime you want to start something new, talk to someone who's been doing it and is doing it well and ask them questions. But I think don't overlook some of those technical things as well of, especially if it's a project that you'd like to start and carry through for a while, see if you can begin on a platform that's going to grow with you and sustain you. So speak with someone who's been doing it, someone like yourself. Or, there's so many people that are doing podcasts and doing quite well, but ask questions and get started too. Like, don't be afraid. You can order really basic equipment very inexpensively. That sounds good. So don't get hung up on the technical things, but getting advice from someone who has been doing it is always a good way to start when you're beginning a new journey or a new task.
Yeah. And I like that you mentioned, it's great to start on something like Anchor. That's where I started off way back in the day. And it's a really easy platform. And it lets you know, is this something I want to do, in 2, 3, 6 months time, etc. And then you can start to, as you mentioned, start to wear headphones and know why you should be wearing headphones when you're, speaking on a podcast or doing a recording. So just to switch it up a little bit, that may not even be an answer, and that's perfectly fine, because I know you're a very open book when it comes to about yourself, the show, etc. But what might be something that not a lot of people know about you that might surprise them?
Oh, that's a great question too. I am such an open book. When I lived in Hawaii, I was a semi-professional fire dancer and belly dancer. And I think some people know that I used to belly dance. I've done a body of research around it as well. But I don't really do the fire dancing so much anymore. But when I lived over there, it was great. I had this group of women and we would book parties and we got paid. And that's why I say semi-professional, because it was something we were making money for. And it was so much fun. And a lot of people are doing it more now. I see it a lot in my neighborhood here in Ocean Beach. There's a big fire community and it's pretty cool, but I like to think we were a little bit cutting edge back then because it wasn't so widely popular. That was a ton of fun. It's really neat to work with fire and to have that elemental nature while you're really in your body and, moving on the earth. And, Hawaii is such a magical place for all of that to happen. So
how does fire dancing work? I've seen also belly dancers, and I've seen people like walk over coals and that, but fire dancing, what does that look like?
So there's a couple different ways. Like some people have the long staffs, and then there's different kind of wicking material you can put on each end. I know Kanic is one type, and then there's another type, I forget the name of it, but it's like a substance you can dip it in gas. There's you can use white gas is what we used to use, and then you light it. And so it'll burn, but it'll stay contained in that wick primarily. And so you can have a really big wick and you get a really big flame, or you can have it smaller. And I learned with poi, which is traditional from Hawaii or from that region, from the Pacific Island region, I think maybe Samoa. And I may be saying that wrong, so I apologize if I am, but it's like 2 chains and then you have little balls at the end so you can kind of swing them around and dance. And it's fun. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's neat to work with fire.
Was there ever any accidents?
I have a little burn. I've got a scar. But nothing major, no. And I think from those accidents, you learn really quickly what you shouldn't be doing and just ways to be careful and, take precautions.
Yeah, that's cool. I like the sound of that. I've seen people, now that you mention it, I've seen people with the ones that are hanging down, like maces, old sort of medieval maces with the balls on fire at the end, sort of swinging about, throwing it up there and catching it.
It's crazy.
It's pretty cool. It's really good. Well, Dr. Alice, I really appreciate you coming on the show today. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I know people will take a lot away, from the topics you've been talking about. For anybody that wants to learn more, either for themselves or for partners or family, etc., about either addiction recovery and, where to listen to your shows about these topics, etc., where's the best place for people to find you?
Sure. So I'm really active on Facebook, Alice Kirby there. You can also check out my website, which is kirbymethodconsulting.com. I have an Instagram presence too, which is Dr. Alice Kirby. But on Facebook, I'm on there pretty regularly. I do a lot of live videos. I talk about some of the trauma healing work and just different ways to change our relationship with stress and anxiety and integrate our nervous system, things like that. But yeah, my website's got all my links and everything as well.
Okay, awesome. So what I'll do, I'll make sure that I drop all the links to your show, the website, Facebook, etc. in the show notes. So if you're listening to this on your podcast app, be sure to check the show notes out and we can direct you over to where to find Dr. Alice. So as I say, I really appreciate you coming on today. And what's your plans for the rest of the day?
I've got a little bit more work to do and my partner has the day off. So I'm hoping I can get him out to the forest and go for a hike.
You'd mentioned that hiking. That's a big thing.
Yeah, I love it. That's what I've been doing a lot of during COVID. So there's an area I discovered recently that actually has trees, which for Southern California is a bit of a rarity. So I'm hoping I can take him there this afternoon.
Oh, that's good. I hope you enjoy that. We've got the kids. They're just doing some schoolwork at the moment. I hope they're doing some schoolwork at the moment. I don't know what they're doing this half hour.
If it's quiet, that's a good sign.
Well, that's a bonus, right? Unless they're making a huge mess somewhere, I'll soon find out. Well, I hope you enjoy your hike. And as I say, I really do appreciate you coming on. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
This has been another episode of Podcaster Stories. If you enjoyed this week's episode, feel free to leave a review on iTunes and share with anybody that you feel might enjoy it. You can find more episodes at podcasterstories.com and on your favourite podcast apps like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify and more. Until the next time, take care and we'll speak soon.